Sarah Martinez had always been the responsible one in her family. At 28, she worked as a marine biologist for the Coastal Research Station in Cedar Bay, a small fishing town that most people only knew from weather reports during hurricane season. Her days were filled with collecting water samples, monitoring marine life, and filing reports that helped protect the delicate ecosystem along the Gulf Coast. The morning of September 15 started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at the research station before dawn, her coffee still steaming in the cool morning air. She had always loved these quiet moments before the day officially began, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The weather forecast had mentioned a tropical storm forming somewhere in the Atlantic, but it was still days away and might not even reach their coastline. Her colleague, Dr. Robert Chen, arrived an hour later with his usual stack of newspapers and worried expression. Robert had been working at the station for 15 years and had seen his fair share of storms. He spread the latest weather maps across their shared desk, pointing to a swirling mass of clouds that looked much larger than it had the day before. "Sarah, look at this," Robert said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the satellite images. "Hurricane Elena has strengthened overnight. The National Weather Service is now predicting it could reach Category 3 status." Sarah leaned over the maps, following the projected path with her finger. The storm was moving northwest, directly toward their section of coast. According to the latest models, it would make landfall sometime Thursday evening, giving them less than 3 days to prepare. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The research station's director, Dr. Patricia Williams, called an emergency meeting to discuss evacuation procedures. Most of the staff lived in town and could evacuate with their families, but Sarah lived alone in a small cottage about 2 miles inland. Her nearest neighbor was old Mr. Henderson, who had stubbornly refused to leave during every storm for the past 20 years. By Wednesday morning, the mandatory evacuation order had been issued for all coastal areas. Sarah spent the day helping secure equipment at the research station, moving sensitive instruments to higher ground and backing up years of research data to secure servers. The wind had already begun to pick up, and the sky had taken on that ominous gray-green color that locals knew meant serious weather was coming. Her supervisor insisted she leave by noon on Thursday, giving her what he called a healthy head start before the worst of the storm arrived. Sarah loaded her car with essential supplies, bottled water, non-perishable food, important documents, and her laptop containing backup copies of her current research. She also packed a bag for her elderly neighbor, hoping she could convince Mr. Henderson to come with her to the inland evacuation center. When she arrived at Henderson's house, she found the 83-year-old man sitting on his front porch, watching the increasingly violent waves crash against the shore. His weathered hands gripped a cup of coffee, and he seemed remarkably calm for someone facing a potentially deadly hurricane. "Mr. Henderson, you need to come with me now," Sarah called over the growing wind. "The evacuation buses stopped running an hour ago, but I have room in my car." The old man shook his head slowly. "Lived through 12 hurricanes in this house, young lady. She's built to last, and so am I. You go on ahead and save yourself." Sarah argued with him for 20 precious minutes, explaining the storm surge predictions and showing him the latest weather reports on her phone. Henderson remained unmoved, insisting that he had supplies and knew how to take care of himself. Finally, with the wind reaching dangerous speeds and debris beginning to fly through the air, Sarah made the difficult decision to leave without him. The drive inland should have taken 45 minutes under normal conditions, but the roads were clogged with last-minute evacuees and emergency vehicles heading in both directions. Sarah found herself stuck in stop-and-go traffic as the first bands of rain began to lash her windshield. The radio crackled with constant updates about road closures and shelter locations. 3 miles from the evacuation center, everything went wrong at once. A massive oak tree, its roots loosened by the saturated ground, crashed across the highway directly in front of her car. Sarah slammed on her brakes, but the wet asphalt sent her vehicle sliding sideways into a drainage ditch. The impact wasn't severe, but her car was thoroughly stuck, its wheels spinning uselessly in the mud. Other drivers stopped to help, but it quickly became clear that her car wasn't going anywhere without a tow truck. A state trooper arrived and offered to take her to the nearest shelter, but Sarah hesitated. In her rush to help Mr. Henderson, she had left her research bag at the station, containing 3 years' worth of data that hadn't been fully backed up. The building was constructed to withstand hurricanes, but if the storm surge reached it, everything could be lost. Against the troopers' strong advice, Sarah decided to return to the research station. She convinced another evacuee to drive her back to town, promising she would only need a few minutes to retrieve her materials. The driver, a local fisherman named Carlos who knew the area well, reluctantly agreed to wait for her. By the time they reached the research station, the storm had escalated dramatically. Wind speeds were approaching 80 miles per hour, and the rain was falling so hard that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. Sarah ran from the truck to the building, fighting against gusts that nearly knocked her off her feet. Inside the station, emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the abandoned offices. Sarah quickly located her research bag and grabbed additional hard drives containing the team's collective work. As she prepared to leave, she heard a loud crash from outside, followed by Carlos shouting her name. When she reached the entrance, she discovered that a large piece of roofing from a nearby building had crushed the truck's windshield. Carlos was conscious but bleeding from several cuts, and the vehicle was clearly no longer operational. The nearest hospital was 12 miles away, and, with the roads rapidly becoming impassable, they were effectively stranded. Sarah helped Carlos into the research station, using the first aid kit to clean his wounds and stop the bleeding. The injuries weren't life-threatening, but he was shaken and disoriented. Outside, the hurricane was reaching its full fury, with wind speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The building shook with each powerful gust, and they could hear debris slamming against the walls. As the hours passed, Sarah realized they were facing a much more serious situation than she had anticipated. The storm surge was higher than predicted, and water was beginning to seep under the doors of the ground floor. She and Carlos moved to the second floor, along with all the research materials they could carry. The power failed completely around midnight, plunging them into darkness except for the emergency lighting that would last only a few hours on battery power. Sarah tried her cell phone repeatedly, but the towers were either damaged or overloaded. The landline at the station was dead, likely due to down power lines. They spent the night huddled in Dr. Williams' office, listening to the storm rage outside and hoping the building would hold together. Carlos drifted in and out of sleep, probably suffering from a mild concussion, while Sarah kept watch and tried to assess their situation. The water on the first floor was now 3 feet deep and rising, making escape increasingly unlikely. Dawn brought little relief. The hurricane had passed, but the flooding was extensive, and they could see from the second-floor windows that most of the town was underwater. Cars were submerged up to their roofs, and pieces of buildings floated past like toys. The research station had held up remarkably well, but they were now on an island surrounded by contaminated floodwater. Sarah rationed their limited food and water supplies, knowing they might be stranded for days. She also tended to Carlos, whose condition seemed stable but required monitoring. Most importantly, she began trying to signal for help, using mirrors to reflect sunlight and hanging bright fabric from the windows. On the second day after the hurricane, they heard the distant sound of helicopters. Sarah rushed to the roof, waving frantically and using a metal tray to reflect sunlight toward the aircraft. The helicopter circled several times but didn't land, probably because the roof wasn't large enough or stable enough for a safe rescue operation. As the third day dawned, their situation was becoming critical. Carlos was developing a fever, possibly from infection in his untreated wounds, and their food was nearly gone. The floodwater was receding slowly, but it was still too deep and dangerous to attempt walking out. Sarah began to wonder if anyone even knew they were missing, or if the rescue teams had written off this part of town as uninhabitable. That afternoon, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. It wasn't the familiar sound of Coast Guard helicopters or emergency vehicles, but the distinctive rumble of military transport boats cutting through the water. Looking out the window, she saw something that seemed almost too good to be true, a small convoy of rigid inflatable boats approaching the research station, operated by what appeared to be military personnel in full tactical gear. The lead boat cut through the murky floodwater with military precision, its operator scanning the area through what appeared to be night vision goggles despite the daylight. Sarah waved frantically from the second-floor window, and immediately saw the helmsman point in her direction and speak into his radio headset. Within minutes, the boat was positioning itself near the partially submerged entrance of the research station. Sarah could now see the occupants clearly, 3 men in military fatigues, their gear suggesting they were special forces rather than regular rescue personnel. The one operating the boat had sergeant stripes on his sleeves, while the other two carried equipment she didn't recognize. "Ma'am, are you injured?" called the sergeant, his voice carrying clearly across the water despite the distance. "How many people are with you?" "2 of us," Sarah shouted back. "My friend has head injuries and possible infection. He needs medical attention." The sergeant nodded and spoke rapidly into his radio. Within moments, one of his companions was assembling what looked like a portable ladder system, while the third man opened a large waterproof medical kit. Their movements were smooth and coordinated, suggesting they had performed similar rescues many times before. The boat maneuvered closer to the building, and Sarah watched in amazement as the team deployed a lightweight aluminum ladder that extended from the boat to her window. The sergeant, who introduced himself as Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, climbed up first to assess the situation. "I'm Torres, United States Navy," he said as he stepped through the window. "We're part of a specialized rescue unit working this sector. Let's take a look at your friend." Sarah led him to Carlos, who was awake but clearly struggling with fever and disorientation. Torres knelt beside him, checking his pulse and examining the headwound with practiced efficiency. He asked Carlos several questions to assess his cognitive function, then spoke quietly into his radio again. "We need to get him to a medical facility quickly," Torres told Sarah. "The good news is we have a corpsman on another boat about 10 minutes away, and our base camp has a field hospital set up. Can you gather whatever you need to bring with you?" Sarah quickly collected her research materials, personal belongings, and the few supplies they had left. As she packed, she couldn't help but ask Torres about their unit. She had expected Coast Guard rescue teams, but this level of military response seemed unusual for a civilian hurricane rescue operation. "We're a joint task force," Torres explained as he helped prepare Carlos for transport. Navy SEALs, Coast Guard, and Marine Force reconnaissance working together on disaster relief operations. Hurricane Elena hit a lot harder than anyone predicted, and there are still hundreds of people unaccounted for in remote areas like this. The rescue process was remarkably efficient. Torres and his team had Carlos secured in the boat within 15 minutes, using a specialized stretcher system that kept him stable during the transfer from the ladder to the vessel. Sarah followed, carrying her research materials and waterproof bags the team provided. As they moved through the flooded town, Sarah was shocked by the extent of the destruction. Entire neighborhoods had been leveled, and the storm surge had pushed boats and cars miles inland. The rescue team navigated through the debris field with skill, following pre-planned routes that avoided the most dangerous areas. Their destination was a temporary base established at the county courthouse, one of the few large buildings that had survived the hurricane with minimal damage. As they approached, Sarah could see a small fleet of military and civilian rescue vehicles, along with several large tents that had been set up as medical and coordination centers. The field hospital was staffed by Navy corpsmen and civilian doctors who had volunteered for the disaster response. Carlos was immediately taken for evaluation and treatment, while Sarah was directed to a debriefing area where she could provide information about other potential survivors in the area. The officer conducting the debriefing was Lieutenant Commander Rachel Hayes, a tall woman with graying hair and kind eyes who seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's story. She took detailed notes about Mr. Henderson and other residents who might have refused to evacuate, adding their locations to a large map covered with colored pins representing completed and pending rescue operations. "You did well to survive 3 days in those conditions," Hayes told Sarah. "Most civilian buildings in that area took significant structural damage. The research station must have been built to higher standards than the surrounding structures." Sarah learned that the Joint Task Force had been conducting rescue operations for 5 days, having been deployed as soon as the hurricane made landfall. They had already rescued over 300 people from flooded and damaged buildings, but the operation was far from over. Many rural areas remained inaccessible, and communications were still largely down throughout the affected region. What surprised Sarah most was the level of coordination between different military branches and civilian agencies. The base camp buzzed with activity as Coast Guard helicopter crews shared intelligence with Navy boat teams, while Marine reconnaissance specialists planned routes through areas that were still too dangerous for standard rescue equipment. After her debriefing, Sarah was assigned a cot in one of the temporary shelters, but she found it difficult to rest. The organized chaos of the rescue operation fascinated her, and she spent hours talking with various team members about their work. Many of them were veterans of overseas deployments who had adapted their skills to domestic disaster relief. The next morning, Sarah learned that Carlos was recovering well and would be transported to a larger hospital for additional treatment. She also received news that Mr. Henderson had been found alive in his damaged but still standing house, rescued by a different SEAL team the previous evening. The old man had survived by moving to his attic when the flooding reached his first floor, living on canned food and rainwater he collected through a hole in his roof. Lieutenant Commander Hayes approached Sarah during breakfast with an unexpected proposition. The task force was planning a systematic sweep of the most heavily damaged areas, documenting the extent of destruction and checking for any remaining survivors or environmental hazards. As a marine biologist familiar with the local ecosystem, Sarah's expertise could be valuable in identifying potential contamination issues or ecological damage that might affect long-term recovery efforts. "We're not asking you to join any dangerous operations," Hayes explained. "But your knowledge of the area and your scientific background could help us assess environmental impacts and plan cleanup priorities. The civilian authorities are overwhelmed, and we need someone who understands both the local geography and potential ecological consequences of this level of flooding." Sarah agreed without hesitation. The opportunity to contribute to the recovery effort appealed to her sense of responsibility, and she was curious to see how the military teams operated in disaster scenarios. She was also deeply concerned about the long-term environmental impact of the hurricane, particularly regarding contamination from damaged industrial facilities and disrupted marine habitats. Her first assignment was to accompany a reconnaissance team led by Sergeant Torres, the same man who had rescued her from the research station. The team's mission was to survey the coastal industrial area, where several chemical plants and fuel storage facilities had suffered damage. Sarah's role was to assess potential contamination risks and identify areas where immediate environmental remediation might be necessary. The survey team consisted of 6 people: Torres and 2 other Navy SEALs, a Marine Corps environmental specialist, a Coast Guard pollution response officer, and Sarah. They traveled by boat through areas that were still partially flooded, documenting damage with cameras and specialized sensors that could detect chemical contamination in the water. The level of destruction was overwhelming. One petroleum storage facility had lost 3 large tanks, spilling thousands of gallons of fuel into the floodwater. A chemical plant that produced agricultural fertilizers had suffered structural damage that allowed ammonia compounds to leak into the surrounding area. The team worked methodically, collecting water and soil samples while maintaining constant radio contact with the base camp. Sarah found herself deeply impressed by the professionalism and dedication of the military personnel. They approached each potential hazard site with careful planning and appropriate safety precautions, while still working with a sense of urgency to identify threats to both human health and the environment. Sergeant Torres, in particular, demonstrated an unexpected knowledge of environmental science, asking informed questions about contamination pathways and ecological impact. During their 3rd day of surveys, the team received an urgent radio call about a new emergency. A group of construction workers who had been conducting damage assessments at a collapsed bridge had become trapped when their work platform was damaged by shifting debris. The accident site was in a particularly dangerous area, with unstable structures and strong currents that made approach by regular rescue boats extremely hazardous. Torres immediately redirected their boat toward the emergency site, while the base camp dispatched additional rescue assets. As they approached, Sarah could see the trapped workers clinging to a partially collapsed concrete platform surrounded by swift-moving water filled with sharp metal debris and broken concrete. The rescue operation required all of the team's specialized skills. The SEALs used climbing equipment to establish secure anchor points on nearby structures, while the marine environmental specialist operated a drone to assess the stability of the platform and identify the safest approach routes. Sarah found herself assigned to coordinate communications between the rescue team and the base camp, relaying technical information about water conditions and structural hazards. The rescue took nearly 4 hours to complete, with each worker being individually evacuated using a complex system of ropes and flotation devices. 2 of the construction workers had suffered serious injuries, requiring immediate medical attention that was provided by the team's corpsmen. Throughout the operation, Sarah was struck by the calm professionalism of the rescue team, who treated the dangerous and complex situation as routine. That evening, back at the base camp, Sarah realized that her perspective on military disaster response had changed completely. She had expected efficient but rigid operations focused primarily on logistics and crowd control. Instead, she had witnessed flexible, adaptive responses that incorporated scientific expertise, environmental considerations, and genuine concern for both immediate human welfare and long-term community recovery. By the end of her first week working with the Joint Task Force, Sarah had become an integral part of their environmental assessment operations. Her scientific background, combined with her growing understanding of military procedures, made her valuable as a liaison between the civilian scientific community and the rescue teams. Lieutenant Commander Hayes offered her a temporary consulting position with the task force, which would allow her to continue working on environmental assessments while the region recovered. The position came with security clearance requirements and additional training, but it also provided an opportunity to contribute to disaster response planning at the federal level. Sarah accepted the position immediately. Her work at the Coastal Research Station could wait. The current environmental crisis required immediate attention from qualified experts. She also found herself genuinely drawn to the military's approach to complex problem solving, which combined technical expertise with decisive action and strong teamwork. Her new role involved working with multiple agencies to develop long-term environmental monitoring plans for the affected area. The hurricane had caused contamination issues that would persist for years, requiring ongoing assessment and remediation efforts. Sarah's responsibility was to design monitoring protocols that could detect pollution problems before they caused permanent ecological damage. The work brought her into regular contact with Sergeant Torres, whose team had been assigned to implement many of the environmental monitoring procedures. Despite their different backgrounds, Sarah and Torres developed an effective working relationship based on mutual respect for each other's expertise. Torres had originally studied environmental engineering before joining the Navy, while Sarah had grown up in a military family and understood the importance of clear communication and reliable procedures. 3 weeks into her consulting assignment, Sarah received news that would change her career trajectory completely. The Department of Defense was establishing a new program to integrate civilian scientific expertise into military disaster response operations. The program would create permanent positions for scientists who could work directly with special forces teams during natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and other emergencies involving environmental hazards. The position would require extensive training in military procedures, physical fitness standards, and security protocols. Successful candidates would become civilian members of joint task forces, with the authority to make decisions about environmental safety during emergency operations. The program represented a recognition that modern disaster response required both military efficiency and scientific expertise. Hayes strongly encouraged Sarah to apply for the program, noting that her performance during the hurricane response had demonstrated exactly the kind of skills and temperament the military was seeking. The application process was competitive and demanding, involving psychological evaluations, fitness testing, and extensive background investigations. Sarah spent 2 months preparing for the application process while continuing her work with the hurricane recovery effort. The environmental monitoring program she had designed was showing encouraging results, with contamination levels decreasing faster than originally predicted. More importantly, the collaboration between military and civilian experts had proven so effective that it was being studied as a model for future disaster response operations. Her application was accepted, making her one of only 12 civilians nationwide to be selected for the program's first class. The training would take place over 6 months at multiple military facilities, covering everything from basic survival skills to advanced emergency procedures. Sarah would learn to operate military equipment, communicate using tactical protocols, and make critical decisions under extreme pressure. The training was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Physical conditioning sessions began before dawn, followed by classroom instruction in subjects ranging from nuclear contamination assessment to biological weapons detection. She learned to use specialized equipment that could identify chemical threats in minutes, and practiced making evacuation recommendations based on rapidly changing environmental conditions. More challenging than the physical demands was learning to think like a military operator. Sarah had to adapt her scientific training, which emphasized careful observation and methodical analysis, to situations requiring immediate decisions based on incomplete information. The instructors repeatedly emphasized that in emergency situations, a quick decision based on sound principles was often better than a perfect analysis that came too late to save lives. Her fellow trainees came from diverse scientific backgrounds: atmospheric chemists, geological engineers, marine biologists, and nuclear physicists. Despite their different specialties, they all shared a commitment to using their expertise in service of disaster response and national security. The training forged strong bonds between team members who would later work together on emergency deployments around the world. Sarah's first operational assignment came 8 months after completing her training. A massive earthquake had struck the Pacific Northwest, causing significant damage to industrial facilities and raising concerns about environmental contamination. Her team was deployed within hours of the disaster, tasked with assessing risks to both human health and ecological systems in the affected area. The deployment demonstrated how much she had changed since Hurricane Elena. Instead of being a victim awaiting rescue, Sarah was now part of the response team, using specialized equipment to detect contamination and making decisions that would affect thousands of people. Her partner on the mission was Sergeant Torres, who had also completed additional training and been assigned to the Environmental Response Unit. Working together, they identified several sites where chemical storage facilities had been damaged, prioritizing them for immediate attention based on the potential risks to nearby communities. Their recommendations guided the deployment of cleanup crews and evacuation decisions, preventing what could have been a major environmental disaster. The earthquake response operation lasted 3 weeks, during which Sarah's team assessed over 200 potentially contaminated sites. Their work enabled civilian authorities to focus cleanup efforts where they were most needed, while ruling out environmental threats in areas where people were eager to return to their homes and businesses. Following the earthquake deployment, Sarah was assigned to the Joint Task Force's permanent headquarters in Virginia, where she helped develop improved protocols for environmental assessment during disaster response operations. Her recommendations were incorporated into training programs for military personnel worldwide, ensuring that future disasters would be met with better coordinated responses. 2 years after Hurricane Elena, Sarah received a visit from Carlos, the fisherman who had been injured during their ordeal at the research station. He had made a complete recovery and returned to his work, but he wanted to thank her for the care she had provided during their 3 days stranded together. Carlos was amazed to learn about her career change and the work she was now doing. "I knew you were something special," Carlos told her. "The way you stayed calm and took care of everything, even when we didn't know if anyone would find us. Now you're the one doing the finding and the taking care of." Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that September morning when she had arrived at the research station expecting a routine day of water sampling. The hurricane had destroyed her quiet, predictable career, but it had also revealed capabilities and interests she never knew she possessed. Her work with the Joint Task Force took her to disaster sites around the world, from volcanic eruptions in Indonesia to chemical spills in Eastern Europe. Each deployment brought new challenges and opportunities to prevent environmental disasters that could affect millions of people. She had found a career that combined her scientific training with the satisfaction of immediate, tangible results. The relationship she had developed with Sergeant Torres had also evolved beyond professional collaboration. They had worked together on over a dozen missions, developing the kind of trust and communication that could only come from facing difficult situations together. Their friendship had gradually become something deeper, built on shared values and mutual respect for each other's dedication to protecting others. On a crisp autumn evening 5 years after Hurricane Elena, Sarah stood on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter in the Gulf of Mexico, conducting water quality assessments following a major oil spill. The technology she was using was far more advanced than anything she had available at the Coastal Research Station, and her team included experts from multiple military branches and civilian agencies. As she watched the sun set over the water, Sarah thought about the research station where she had once worked alone, studying marine ecosystems in comfortable isolation. That building had been rebuilt and expanded, now serving as a regional center for environmental monitoring and disaster preparedness. The quiet, solitary career she had once enjoyed seemed like a lifetime ago. Her radio crackled with a report from Torres, who was leading a parallel assessment operation from a helicopter overhead. His team had identified additional areas requiring immediate attention, and they would need to coordinate their response with civilian authorities and international environmental groups. The complexity of modern disaster response operations required exactly the kind of integrated approach that Sarah and her colleagues had pioneered. Environmental Team Alpha, this is Air Unit 7, Torres's voice came through clearly. We've got visual confirmation of contamination plumes extending further east than originally mapped. Recommend expanding assessment perimeter to include coastal marshlands approximately 12 nautical miles from your current position. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began calculating how to modify their sampling patterns to cover the additional area. The work was demanding and often dangerous, but it was also deeply satisfying. Each successful operation meant communities that could recover faster from disasters, ecosystems that could be protected from long-term damage, and lives that could be saved through better environmental monitoring. The hurricane that had once left her stranded and helpless had ultimately led her to a career where she would never be helpless again. More importantly, it had taught her that the greatest satisfaction came not from safe, predictable work, but from using her abilities to help others in their most desperate moments. Sarah Martinez had indeed come back with a SEAL team, but more than that, she had become an integral part of the team herself.